Thank you very much for having me. Hello, RGCS, everyone who's out there and following. I feel very honored to speak here today and to be invited to this. And when I prepared the presentation, I was reminded on my very first meeting, I guess, with RGCS in the French embassy in London. I think it was in spring 2015, and there might be other people here who still remember this. And I remember the joy of meeting other international scholars who actually have the same research interest than I do, you know, who look into collaborative workspaces, and where we found a ground to discuss. And I think we've come a long, long way since then. And in less than, I would say, 10 years since this phenomenon really took off, we managed to establish an interdisciplinary research field around this phenomena, right, of co-working, but also of collaborative workspaces. And that's basically thanks to all of you who keep doing research on this topic, right, who work on new research questions, and who push the boundaries inside their different disciplines that, you know, come together in those type of meetings here. And I think with those research efforts, we managed to bring this topic into the best academic journals within our disciplines. And that's quite an amazing achievement. And I also think the co-working library, you know, that is filled now thanks to Johanna and their little hackathon, is a very great testimony of that. Moreover, co-working is more and more reflected in policy development, right? So the topic seems to have arrived there too. It seems that co-working has been added to the regular urban planner vocabulary and its toolbox, and is there seen as the potential conduit for stimulating entrepreneurship or innovation in metropolitan context, but increasingly also in rural and in periphery areas or in smaller cities. So I want to use the chance today to speak here to address a couple of questions and themes I work on, but I also want to talk about a couple of blind spots I think that we have in co-working research or in research on collaborative workspaces. In preparation for this keynote, I sort of reread my huge stack on papers I have on co-working, especially the ones that came out in the last 2 years, and found a couple of construction sites. I mean, there are many, and Clay Spinuzzi addressed already a couple of those yesterday in his keynote, right? That for central terms, we still, you know, have no proper definitions like community, collaboration. It's still very widely used, but never really drilled down. But we also have a growing diversity of collaborative workspaces to address, right? And we haven't really developed proper typologies of that. But we also have to overcome the problem of single case studies that mainly constitute our empirical research, or how do we deal with all the ambivalences and also disjunctures we can see in the current collaborative workspaces. So what I want to talk briefly about is what drives my research. And this is where the title came from, but also I want to address a couple of questions related to the current pandemic and how that might affect collaborative workspaces, and then talk about 3 blind spots that are relevant for my work and I hope might also be recognized by you. So let me go into my presentation. Do I have the rights? Federica?
I think you should have the right.
No.
Yeah. I can't see my PowerPoint presentation as something he gives me. I can't be. That never happens. It always works well in teaching.
You click on the share screen button.
Yeah, I know, but he doesn't show me my PowerPoint as a program I can choose from. He shows me everything else, Word, Whiteboard, Safari.
I don't know, maybe if you can share your PDF, or I don't know.
Or just screen.
What a pity.
Okay, now we can see your desktop.
Can you see the presentation, the PowerPoint program?
Yes.
Like this?
We see it perfectly.
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, my background is in urban sociology, and I guess that brings a particular focus with it. And that focus is for me the question around the social and the spatial organization of independent work. And under independent work, I look specifically into freelance worker, but also into self-employed workers. And that sort of builds on previous research I did on labor conditions in culture and creative industries and on creative milieus. And the term individualization is here borrowed from Manuel Castells, right, who wrote extensively in The Rise of the Network Society on this ongoing individualization of labor in the labor process. And where he said we see the emergence of flexible work patterns due to new information technologies, but also because of the restructuring in industrial sectors, and that change work in 4 crucial dimensions. And I guess that's also what Clay Spinuzzi talked about yesterday, and what we all know, right? It changes for people how long they work, right? Basically, there are no limits anymore. It also changes for people where they work, so in terms of location, but it also changes the expectations around a job, right? It drills down mostly to a task orientation and has less to do with future careers. And it also has a changed employment relationship. There's no social contract anymore for those type of independent workers. So that leaves me with the question, how do then independent workers organize their own workplace and economic production without the safety nets that are usually afforded to employed workers? And this inquiry is sort of based on a couple of assumptions that should also be quite well known, I guess, if you deal with co-working and collaborative workspaces. And one of those is that we can see with ICT that work becomes way more fragmented into on-demand tasks, but that it also stretches over multiple sites and that it's always with people, right? So basically, everywhere is now a place of work. And this notion of a workplace as a spatial and temporal locus becomes completely redesigned. Also, another point, very important, is that this individualized modes of work blur this distinction between production and reproduction in cities, but also in homes. What we see is that people work in cafes and restaurants, in parks or in stations. And all those places now become workplaces because people are always locked in. Then there is this assumption, and this is sort of driving my interest into co-working spaces, is this rise of new work might also lead to the emergence and diffusion of new organizational forms and institutions, right? And what might those be? And what those institutions might serve are exactly the social needs of workers that are not covered anymore, right? And when the life becomes so uncertain, transient, and an episodic nature of work, then this might have effect on the workers' biographies, on the life narratives, but also on their identities. And we see that workers will look for new forms of social embeddedness, of building social relations in local contexts. And another point that was highlighted very much by Richard Florida, but kind of, wasn't very looked into with his whole theory about the creative class, is his argument of saying that places will really play an important role in organizing independent work in the future. So it's not organization, but it's particular places. And this is basically what I'm looking into, and where co-working spaces are just one part of it. And for me, co-working spaces, or the broader category of collaborative workspaces, is really about a social arrangement that answers certain needs of independent workers for social belonging, for having colleagues, to construct a stable personalized work identity in the absence of the attachment to organization, to established professions and their codified roles, their occupational continuity that you would have, or shared work activities. So in a way, one could claim they function as a surrogate organization for them. So for me, it makes total sense to bring urban studies together with the sociology of work, and to really look how particular spaces or places shape social relationships, right? And how they could serve to help those independent workers, and to, research how independent workers socially, but also spatially organize their work lives. And this is sort of like my main concern. I'm not looking into entrepreneurship. I'm not interested in if that, steers innovation, etc. But for me, it's coming from understanding working conditions of those. type of workers and the kind of new places or even new organizations they create. And that sort of sparked my interest in co-working a couple of years ago. That brings me to my second topic. What might be the impacts and the effects we have seen of the COVID-19 pandemic on collaborative workspaces? I think the pandemic, hit at the heart of collaborative workspaces because those thrive on the social benefits of proximity. And we know that physical proximity, but also serendipitous social contacts are now seen as occasions that could spread the virus, right? So it basically hit what was so important about co-working. Furthermore, if you go on a more macro level, you see that the pandemic very much acts like a magnifying glass. It augments existing problems and social, economic, and ethnic and racial inequalities that we have in our societies on a very large scale. And as Clay Spinuzzi on the other side reminded us yesterday, why co-working really took off after the economic and financial crisis in 2007, 2008, it might be now a moment to think through what those effects might be now after this massive, massive crisis we experience. So this pandemic offers new research opportunities, right? And I guess many of those are already addressed in the sessions throughout the conference. And one of those I looked into is the resilience of co-working. So to actually ask, how did they maintain, we see that a majority of spaces was really hit hard, had enforced closure, with significant drops in membership, but also in additional incomes. Nevertheless, many spaces managed very well to go through this crisis. They adapted rather very quickly, right? They adapted their operational models, their policies, and also introduced new distancing protocols with more personal space for each co-worker. And what we also see is to maintain their community, they quickly switched into a remote co-working form, right? They used the digital platforms to keep their communities together, to keep the routines and to keep the rituals they had within the space. So each individual co-worker could keep their work activity patterns, but of course they also used it to look out for each other. And another point that has also been sort of accelerated through this crisis is the rise of digital co-working. By that I mean purely digital platforms that we see arising where, or that emulate a co-working space, how it would look, physically with work areas, but also with social meeting areas, but who remain completely online, right? A second point in terms of what has changed through COVID-19, what might be immediate and sort of the short-term effects, I think we also see very interesting developments. The first, the social distancing, many spaces introduced those distancing rules. So we see now much more personal workspace, which might impact the way social relationships are created in the spaces. It might lower the potential for serendipitous contacts, but also maybe has effects on belonging or community engagement. We also see new activity patterns. Many reported that they work less from co-working spaces, so that they do this hybrid model of co-working. So only a day in the space and then maybe from the home office. We also see material adaptations. So many spaces rebuilt their layout or adapted their layout to create more space for individual workspaces, or take away social areas to enable more personal workspace, but also to introduce touch-free appliances and uses. And one of the things that is always suggested is that we probably don't see much social areas in the future, but rather that personal workspaces inside a bigger co-working space might be the future of how co-working spaces will look like. Another point I found pretty interesting that I could see is that many defined new priorities, right? They completely reframed the way they described them. They created new narratives, whether it's like in this image, they call themselves now a safe alternative to the home office, right? Or a safe space to work. Or they introduced notions of work-life balance much more stronger, or even many talk about wellness now, and that this is their main sort of concern, and that they will provide this to their co-workers. And the last point that is really showing in the Asian context, but also in Australia at the moment, is this huge demand from corporations. Where corporations now rent flexible office spaces inside bigger co-working spaces, you know, to bring in their office workers, for example, if they can't comply with hygienic rules and can't provide that with inside their own office spaces. So that might be, you know, another push for this corporatization of collaborative workspaces. And those might have, you know, those taken together, significant influence and how co-working will look like in the future, and might look quite different from what we know. If you think through the long-term effects, I guess, in terms of speculating about that, the biggest change is that with this pandemic, we've seen the social norm of the work of the office and office work has disappeared, right? We know for a while that it's very much possible to work from the home office. The ICT infrastructure has been there. We had all the tools to do so, but it was mainly companies who refused to do so. And it was for several reasons, right? It was sometimes legal reasons, like it's here in Germany, where it's quite unsure about the insurance situation of people when they work from their home office. But very often it was for secrecy reasons that companies weren't unsure about that. Or it is because they have invested a lot in real estate, right? And sort of wanted people to use it. Or maybe you remember the Yahoo controversy a couple of years ago, where they basically said, if people don't work inside the office, the company can't be that innovative as it needs to be. So they brought people back. But this sort of has broken, right? Through this pandemic, many companies realized that they can actually work, that this is not a concern, and that more and more people will in the future ask for that. Estimations say, and I think Claes Benuzzi showed that yesterday as well, that in advanced economies, we consider 40% of the current workforce to be able to work full-time at a home office. So that provides a massive growth potential for flexible workspaces, right? And that will have a huge impact on the spatial organization of work in cities, and of course also on the office real estate model that we find in many inner city areas. Surely this will also depend in the longer perspective on how much productivity in a home office can be achieved, right? And whether there is an advantage, or at least if it can keep up with the current levels of, or with the former levels of productivity. But it will surely change the geography of people and the ones of jobs. And then of course that will have impacts on the housing markets in cities, and then on the commercial property markets, and as well on the retail infrastructure in inner cities. And that in the end can cause a huge tax and income problem for cities, right? So it might not be that gloomy future for cities. And maybe you remember kind of those cries from the UK government during the summer for the employees to turn or to come back to the office spaces in the inner city to support the smaller businesses, because there's still only 20% of the workforce have ever returned to the offices, right? And many businesses suffer from that. Nevertheless, all those effects are at the moment purely speculation. We don't really know, and the future is very uncertain. It's also uncertain how the future will look like. Will we ever get rid of the virus? Will that be something that always stays with us? Or will a vaccination bring anything back that looks like the old normal? Or what will be sort of the new thing? So the pandemic should also be a moment to contemplate a little bit. And I think one of the things that this crisis has very much shown, or that the virus has exposed, that it is this massive amount of social inequalities on a scale we have not seen before, I guess, and that sort of were right in our face. And it has also exposed our vulnerabilities and our interdependencies. And I guess it has shown for more people than ever that we live in a highly, highly interconnected world. So it might also be a moment for us as researchers to start looking at what we not look so far when we think and research collaborative workspaces. And I have 3 blind spots I want to address here, and I would like to discuss with you as part of this presentation. And that in a way also come out of this sort of specific year we had so far. These 3 blind spots, I think, have reached a new urgency because of the pandemic. And they are not an exhaustive list, but I consider them quite important if we take seriously understanding new work arrangements in the varying degrees of social, but also spatial organizationality. And from my perspective, for the past couple of years, 2 strands of research on collaborative workspaces have developed. And there's one strand that is very much about understanding the phenomena and its empirical variety. It really looks into the what is it, right, and how does it function, and looks a lot into what defines a collaborative workspaces, how do they work in practice, but also what shapes the culture of work in those spaces. And it focuses a lot on the workers, their motivation, and sort of what makes them stay in a specific space. Then there is a second strand that emerged in the last couple of years. And there it's very much about using co-working spaces or collaborative workspaces as a lens, as an empirical case for all sorts of new theoretical approaches and development. And there it's less about the phenomenon as such and understanding it, and rather about bringing it into dialogue with discipline-specific debates. And what characterizes both strands is that they very much look into the inside of those spaces, almost like it would be a container, right? It's very much about what happens inside those places, organizations, but it's very much less about the outside of it. And what we lack so far is the recognition of all the different roles that these spaces might have in different spatial contexts, or even to think through what those type of spaces might be in terms of collective actorhood. And that even so, we know that some of those places or spaces have become quite powerful actors. If we think on WeWork on a global scale, or if we think on particular smaller spaces in cities like Berlin, the Factory, or Second Home in London, or even this global network of impact hubs, right? So to think beyond those individual spaces is something I find lacking in the current literature, and I find quite important if you think further collaborative workspaces. So the first point I want to talk about is something that could be called in relation to Richard Seymour as the urban bias of co-working research, right, where we have this strong bias towards urban areas as our empirical sites, and where sort of other spatial contexts more or less remain a kind of blind spot. This is a topic already addressed. There's this cost action program now, so this is very, very helpful, right? But still the majority of our papers, the knowledge that is produced is based on spaces in bigger cities. That leaves us with lots of questions, right? And one of the hopes at the moment is that the whole COVID-19 pandemic will bring more independent workers to smaller cities or to more rural region, right? And we have seen those mobility patterns already before the pandemic, where some actors choose to leave the bigger cities with their high prices for housing and land, and where they try to flee sort of the negative externalities of those agglomerations. Nevertheless, that leaves us with some important question, and maybe co-working spaces or collaborative workspaces in more rural and peripheral areas might look quite different and might serve different needs than we would have in cities. Vasilis Avdikas, Ignacy Capdevila and I, we are finishing up a smaller research project we have done based on a bigger surveys among smaller co-working spaces across Europe, and where we are now trying to write our first paper out of that research, and where we could find a couple of characteristics that clearly show that those spaces might look different than what we see in cities. And what we see is way more variety in terms of demographics, especially older age groups, and of course, way more professional backgrounds from the people. We also see that in those spaces, it's way less about events and very much about a basic working infrastructure. There's also hardly prototyping going on. Those spaces are also less entrepreneurial, and they're also not interested in entrepreneurial ecosystems. And it's much more about freelance workers and sort of who work with long-term clients, right? Most of these spaces are also smaller. They're often the only space around, so there's neither competition nor help from other spaces, right? They're often very singular. And a quite interesting fact, and that sort of provoked a huge debate in Germany right now, is that they serve more as a social infrastructure for the whole village or the smaller city, right, than actually just as this shared office space. So they take over many, many, many functions that other types of social spaces might have taken over, but that those cities or regions or rural areas actually lack. So it's less about new firm growth, about entrepreneurship or about innovation or economic change, and very much about working or other types of social needs. And I guess similar to what Richard Seymour observed for innovation activities of companies in peripheral regions, we can also see that paradoxically, in the end, those spaces are socially and culturally more diverse than they are in cities, right? Because they bring in so many people, and it's way more about physical proximity for them, right, than a shared interest that brings them to those spaces. So that might mean you might need more curation, to facilitate more interaction among the people working there. And it's a lot about what they call ease of access. So it's very important for them to have infrastructure access and access to public transport or roads that connect them to bigger cities. So I guess that has many implications, how we think of collaborative workspaces. And one is this looking deeper into that relationship between collaborative workspaces and their spatial context, the role it has, and the particular meanings that might change of those spaces. We have not explored this very much so far. We also have often taken for granted that co-working is an urban phenomenon. But I think it's quite crucial to understand how it might change, and especially in meaning, right? And in meaning, for example, in Germany, the debate we have at the moment is that those type of infrastructures in more rural areas are now labeled as part of the public service infrastructure, right? As part of their usual provision and not as particular collaborative workplaces. So that gives those providers, a boost, but also much more access to public health. And this relates to that they serve as more social infrastructures than just a workspace within those villages or smaller cities. Another point is we've also so far little examined what actually the political economy of those places do in terms of or in relation to collaborative workspaces. And the other question is, it's more an economic geography one, but really to ask, how does an existing economic geography actually shapes this phenomena of co-working? We know that those agglomeration economies in those bigger metropolitan cities, that those shape co-working a lot, but how is it in a rural area, in a smaller city, right? Or a place where it's just one industry that dominates the whole region? Does it have any effect? The type of people we find there, the type of independent work that we find, are there any relationships or specific effects? And another point is, how is this actually growing, this phenomena in those type of region? Is it all by mobility? Is it all by sort of imported people from the bigger cities? Or who's driving those developments? Another point is, I think we also look way too little into at the moment, is the role of neighborhoods, which have recently gotten assigned, at least in this WeWork campaign, a new role. You know, I mean, I find it striking because WeWork so far always positioned itself as about being inner city locations, right? Being there where business is and not necessarily where people live. And now they completely changed their strategies, at least here in the German context. And now they advertise themselves as being the neighborhood workspace provider for people. So an important topic for me is also to look into neighborhoods as a spatial context for collaborative workspaces, but also as work, as a place to organize work for independent workers, and also as alternative economic sites for value creation. So to look closer, what is the role of cafes, lobbies, or sidewalks now that those are all places where people work, right? How does that change? And so far we have some interesting literature emerging that can be used for that, right? There is an interesting new literature or body of literature that connects entrepreneurship research with neighborhood research and looks a lot into the role of housing for independent workers. And we also have research that looks into the multi-sidedness of work under those notions of work ecosystems or workscapes. So, you know, that try to trace where individual workers do work. And it's not just at home or in their home office or in their collaborative workspace, but it's on way more location and try to capture that. And I think a nice quote from that is from a research project I started last year, is sort of from Circular Space here in Berlin, where they clearly say, we are not an island just because we have a house with a door to close, right? And I find we haven't really looked much yet into all those social, cultural, or economic relationships that collaborative workspaces might have in neighborhoods, and, you know, the role they play for individual people in organizing spatially their work life. An interesting project right now, just to show you, is a project from Lucas Stevens and Richard Shearmore, where they just published a paper on, and where they tried to trace those new geographies of work from service workers in Montreal, and where they can clearly show these workscapes, right? How people work on very different locations throughout the day and perform their work activities there. And some are fixed, some are more transient, some are more spontaneous, etc. And they give you an idea about sort of those new geographies. And the last point I'm working on, or started thinking, of course, based on the pandemic quite a lot, is to think through a bit more if co-working spaces or collaborative workspaces could also act as an infrastructure of care, right? And this ties into a thinking that sees those type of spaces within an alternative economic narrative, but also try to connect it with emancipative politics, and to think through what might be the wider social role that co-working spaces might play in neighborhoods, within cities, but also beyond in social or in political struggles, right? It's a topic that we have in the research field, but a question for me would be to think through whether they could actually act as those infrastructures where an ethics of care is sort of practiced and where actual care is practiced, right? And one of the points, you know, that sort of stipulated that was the publication of the Care Manifesto by the Care Collective, because one of the crucial points in this book is to think care way beyond the usually hands-on approaches of care that we have, right? To think beyond the nurturing as parenting, or to think beyond places that we usually associate with care, like daycare shelters for homeless people, or for disadvantaged people, or to think about community food shops, but to go beyond and sort of think through what might be new key sites for care in cities, and what sort of, you know, what they could do to grow an ethics of care. And what they mean by care is, you know, the individual, or as our individual or common ability to provide the political, the social, material, and emotional conditions that allow the vast majority of people and living creatures on this planet to thrive along with the planet itself. So what you see there is that, you know, they use quite a broad, a way more active definition. I think it's something that we can connect quite well with collaborative workspaces. And I find many occasions in my research where people, whether it was co-workers or whether it was hosts, actually talked about giving care or receiving care, right? For example, caring is a huge part of what hosts do. This emotional labor, we already described that, right? Sort of what they do on a daily basis to create this welcoming atmosphere, to listen in to co-workers, right? To attend to their specific needs. But I also hear a lot in my interviews that co-workers says they feel cared for in a space. They especially use that type of vocabulary. And so I'm started looking more into that and to think through with this care lens what those spaces might mean and what type of benefits they might bring in terms of time. Just want to sum up a few points that when I went through my literature, but also in other papers where I found this incidence of forms of care within co-working spaces, I think we have quite a lot. We find the self-care. There's a lot described that, you know, people go to those places because as a form of mental well-being. We have this care that is given through hosts. It's the listening, it's the pointing towards help, it's the realizing the situational needs, but it's also help and support among those co-workers that range from professional support towards emotional support, but also often describe genuine friendship, right? That also then becomes a source of care. I think a very crucial form of care that they can receive in co-working spaces is recognition, right? This peer-to-peer recognition where people get recognized as someone, they get recognized as someone who's a designer or who's a programmer, right? Where other people see them actually performing their work and see them as a professional. So they can, you know, align with their professional identity and use that as a source of self-worth. But it's also increasingly about mutual help and solidarity. We see a lot, and especially now through the crisis, that co-workers help each other, that they set up mutual funds to help each other, but also that some start on a more collective level to actually argue for their needs, or what has become here very popular in Berlin is that now co-working, or there are many co-working spaces with childcare facilities. And the last point is, of course, one can also think about the knowledge that is created within the space and the resources within that community as a form of commons that emerges among the co-workers, right, through certain types of practices they do there. So that's why I want to close with a hopeful note in introducing that topic. Of course, we could also talk a lot about, you know, inequalities we see, all forms of social inclusion, and that have become more visible during this crisis. But I think using that care lens and thinking more through what those spaces could do for enhancing, you know, for facilitating care practices, for creating caring relationships, and for fostering this ethics of care, not just within the space, but within neighborhoods and within cities, is a very, very crucial point and function they could take, especially as we have seen with the crisis, that care is nothing that is really highly valued in our neoliberal societies, right? So a care lens now helps very much in recognizing the interdependencies that we have and foster mutual responsibilities, and by that, maybe also solidarities. And it feeds into a perspective that sees social change more in incremental practices than, you know, actually facilitated, for example, through protest, but rather through those everyday practices of informal care that we can see in those spaces. And one way would be to, think more through what those possibilities might be and how those in the end could also transform the spaces, the neighborhoods, but also the cities, and enable social change. And this is where I want to end and say thank you.